She had learned over 12 years not to expect anything. The dog had not learned this. That was the difference. Eleanor Marsh stood at the gate of the Cliff Cottage with a key in her hand and a December wind coming off the Atlantic, and Duke was already 3 steps ahead of her, his black and tan body angled toward the cottage door, his nose working the salt air with the absolute precision of a dog who had not spent 12 years being told that things did not work out. He was 4 years old. He had no prison in his history. The cottage sat at the edge of the bluff, weatherboarded and gray, the paint long gone to bare wood where the coastal weather had stripped it, the garden gone to wild rosemary and rugosa rose. From here she could see the Atlantic below the cliff, gun-colored in December, running swells that hit the rocks without drama and receded without remorse. The same ocean that had been here when she was a child, when this cottage had been called Marsh Cottage, and had smelled of her grandmother's coffee and wool blankets and wood smoke. On the gatepost, mounted with brass screws that had gone green with salt air, was a teak sign, hand-routed letters, still clean. Marsh Cottage, 1923. The teak had not rotted. She put her hand on it for a moment. Duke looked back at her from the cottage door, ears forward, amber eyes steady, and she took the key out of her coat pocket and went to let them in. 12 years, 2 months, and 9 days ago, Eleanor Marsh had been convicted of wire fraud and conspiracy in the Federal District Court of the Eastern District of North Carolina. The fraud had involved a nonprofit land conservation organization she'd run for 11 years. Money had moved from accounts she controlled to accounts she didn't recognize, and she had not been able to explain how, and the government's case had been built on her signature appearing on documents she maintained she'd never seen. Her brother Patrick had testified for the prosecution. He was the only person in her life who had the organizational expertise to move funds the way they'd been moved. He was the only person who had unfettered access to the nonprofit's files. He was also the only person who stood to benefit from her removal from the scene. The conservation organization held title to 3 parcels of coastal land that Patrick had been attempting, unsuccessfully, to purchase for development for 7 years. None of this had been enough. The jury had deliberated for 4 hours. Eleanor had served her sentence at the federal prison in Alderson, West Virginia. She had not appealed. Her lawyer had called the appeal unlikely to succeed, and she had no money for a lawyer by then anyway. Patrick had been managing her finances. During the arraignment period, for which she had given him power of attorney, and the management had consisted of disbursements she only understood in retrospect, she came out with Duke, given to her by the prison's canine rehabilitation program, a German shepherd trained by inmate volunteers, and an address on a piece of paper and very little else. The address had come from a letter she'd received during her 9th year inside. The letter was from a law firm in Beaufort, North Carolina. It notified her that a sealed letter was being held in trust for her, left by her maternal grandmother, Florence Marsh, deceased 1987, to be delivered to Eleanor Marsh upon the occasion of her most urgent need. The law firm had considered the delivery of this notification to have been triggered by her incarceration. The sealed letter itself waited in their offices. She had not been able to retrieve it for 3 years. The conditions of her parole had restricted her travel, and then there were the months of finding her footing, the motel and the temporary work, and the long business of rebuilding herself from the outside in. She'd driven to Beaufort on a Tuesday in November, Duke in the back seat of the second-hand Civic she'd saved for, and she'd sat in the law firm's waiting room with her hands folded and received from a young attorney the sealed letter that her grandmother had, written 24 years before Eleanor ever went to prison. The letter was 4 sentences long. Eleanor, I know what Patrick is. I have kept everything that proves it and everything that protects you in the East Room at the cottage. I have sealed the room so that what's inside stays safe until you need it. The cottage is yours, my will says so. Whatever your brother may try to tell you otherwise, come when it's time. It was signed, Florence. Eleanor had put the letter in her coat pocket and walked out to the car and sat for a while. Duke had pressed his nose against the back of her seat and breathed on the back of her neck. She bought the cottage for $24,000, the county's appraised value for what had been listed as an abandoned structure, because Patrick had filed the estate incorrectly and the property had ended up in county limbo. She paid with money from the fund the prison rehabilitation program had helped her open. She borrowed the rest. She left on a Sunday, the first weekend of December. Duke rode in the back seat and observed the passing landscape with his characteristic seriousness, tracking birds, through the window, monitoring vehicles that came up fast from behind, noting the change from Piedmont to coastal plain as the road flattened and the air through the cracked window shifted from cold clay to cold salt. She watched him in the rearview mirror and thought, not for the first time, that he paid better attention than she did. She stopped for gas outside New Bern and ate a sandwich in the parking lot, sharing the bread with Duke, who accepted it with the dignity of a dog who understood that charity was sometimes the correct form of kindness. She had the grandmother's letter in her coat pocket. She had also, in the folder on the passenger seat, a printout of the county property record, the purchase agreement, and she'd been thorough about this. A copy of every public document she could find about her conviction and its circumstances. 12 years old now. Some of it she hadn't read in years. She read it now while Duke ate the bread. She was looking at it the way she'd learned to look at things in prison. Not for what it said, but for what it didn't say. The accounts the money had moved to, the dates of the wire transfers, the name of the signatory on the receiving end. The name of the signatory was a holding company. She'd known this. She hadn't had the resources to investigate, at the time, who controlled the holding company. She hadn't known, until she looked now at public corporate filings available online, that the holding company had been dissolved in 2015 and its assets transferred to a real estate development company controlled by a managing partner, whose name was Patrick Marsh. She sat in the parking lot outside New Bern for some time. Duke came and put his muzzle against her shoulder from the back seat. "I know," she said, "I know." She started the car and drove to the coast. She stopped in Beaufort at the County Register of Deeds, where the clerk was friendly and efficient, and confirmed that the title to the Marsh Cottage property had been cleared by the purchase she'd completed last month. She held the deed in her hands. Eleanor Frances Marsh, sole owner, and the feel of it was specific, the weight of paper that said something real. She also stopped at the local historical society, a narrow building on Front Street, staffed by a volunteer in a warm vest who was delighted to discuss the Marsh family of the Outer Banks for 20 minutes. The Marshes had been a coastal family since the early 20th century, the volunteer told her, fishing folk originally. Then the grandfather had done well in hardware. The grandmother Florence had been known for her work with the coastal conservation movement in the 70s, had been one of the founders of what was now the County Land Trust. "Florence Marsh," Eleanor said. "You knew her?" "Of her," the volunteer said carefully. "She died before I moved here, but she's in the records. Quite a character from what people say." A pause. There was some kind of dispute in the late 80s about the land the trust held. Someone tried to buy parcels that weren't legally for sale. Florence apparently blocked it at every turn. Another pause. "She died fairly suddenly, 1987. After that, things got complicated." Eleanor thanked him and went back to the car. Duke was standing in the back seat looking south, his nose working the window gap, his tail still. She drove south. The cottage appeared at the end of a lane that was barely wide enough for the car. The rugosa rose had grown across it on both sides, the canes catching at her door mirrors. She came through into a clearing and stopped, and Duke pressed his nose against the window gap and drew in the salt air in long rhythmic pulls, his black and tan body still with concentration, his tail low. The teak sign said Marsh Cottage, 1923. She'd seen it in photographs. The lawyer had one in his files. But photographs hadn't conveyed the quality of the wood. The sign was as solid and legible as the day it had been installed, the teak honey-colored and dense, the letters as sharp as if they'd been cut last year. Everything else on the property had been destroyed by decades of coastal weather. The sign had simply refused to be. Duke was at the gate before she'd opened her door. The interior of the cottage was dim and cold, a long-abandoned cold. Not the cold of a winter day, but the accumulated cold of years without heat, the walls holding it like stone. The smell was sea damp and old wood and something underneath, faintly floral like dried lavender or old sachets. She stood in the main room and looked around slowly. The furniture was still there, draped in sheets that had yellowed and stiffened, but still there. A sofa, a chair, a small dining table, a corner cupboard. The floors were wide plank pine, weathered but solid. Windows faced east, toward the ocean, and even in December the gray light came through them steadily, the light of an overcast coast, without warmth but without harshness. Duke moved through the rooms with deliberate efficiency, room by room, his nose sweeping each corner, each baseboard, each doorway. She followed him more slowly, lifting the sheets on the furniture and looking at what was underneath, touching the cupboard handles, the window sills. Her grandmother had touched all of this. Florence had sat at this table, had looked through these windows at this ocean. In the kitchen, she found a tin of tea on the shelf, sealed, still good if tea stayed good for decades. She found a matchbox with 3 matches left. She found in the lowest cupboard drawer a folded handkerchief with a monogram, FM. Pressed into it, she took the handkerchief. Duke barked once from the back of the cottage. She followed the sound down a short hallway that ran behind the kitchen. The hallway ended at what should have been a door to the east bedroom. She'd seen the floor plan. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, east and west. The west bedroom was open, its door standing ajar. The east side of the hallway ended in a wall. Not a wall that had always been there. The framing on either side of where the door should have been was still visible, the ghost of the doorway still readable in the structure, and the section filling it was brick. Not old brick matching the cottage's foundation, newer brick laid carefully and mortared well, but clearly an addition. The bricks were a slightly different color, the mortar lines slightly different from everything surrounding them. Duke stood directly in front of the bricked section. He did not touch it. He stood and looked at it, and then looked at Eleanor with the expression that she'd come to understand, in their months together, meant, "This is the thing." She put her hand on the brick, cold and solid. She could feel the mortar between the courses. Her grandmother had built this wall. She went to find Carl. She didn't have to go far. Carl was the name the Historical Society volunteer had mentioned. The Hendersons do all the cottage work on this stretch. Carl Henderson, his father did the Marsh cottage work back in the day. She'd written the name down. She found him 3 properties south, doing what appeared to be storm window work on a larger cottage. He was a man in his 50s, lean, the kind of coastal county lean that came from 30 years of outdoor physical work. He looked at her business card from the law firm, and then at her. "Marsh Cottage," he said. "My father did work out there. I've done some over the years, keeping the structure sound." "Someone was maintaining it," Eleanor said. "My father, then me. Florence Marsh, your grandmother, I take it, left instructions and a small fund. Keep the structure sound. Don't touch the east room." He paused. "I never did. She had you seal the room?" "My father did the brickwork, 1987 July, couple months before she passed. He said she supervised the whole thing herself, knew exactly what she wanted and made sure he did it right." He looked at her steadily. "She told my father, 'Someday a woman named Eleanor will come and need to know what's in there. She'll know what to do with it. I need to open it,' Eleanor said. He came with her. The brickwork, as Carl explained while he walked, had been done to be opened again. His father had used a mortar that was strong enough to hold for decades but scored at the courses to allow removal, without destroying the surrounding frame. He brought tools from his truck, a cold chisel, a drilling hammer, a short pry bar. He showed Eleanor what her grandmother had instructed his father to do. Duke sat at the base of the bricked section while Carl worked the first course of brick loose. He watched the work with absolute attention, ears forward, tail low, not moving. When the first brick came free and the cold air from the sealed room came through, Duke stood up. His nose went into the gap and he drew in a long, thorough breath, and Eleanor watched the fur along his spine settle, as if whatever he'd found there confirmed something. "Your grandmother put something in there," Carl said. He was looking at Duke. "She did," Eleanor said. "He worked for 40 minutes, removing brick course by course, setting each brick in a careful stack beside the wall. Duke watched every brick come out. When the opening was large enough to see into the room beyond, Duke sat back down and looked at Eleanor and waited. She stepped through. While Eleanor stood in the sealed room, Carl remained in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe with the particular patience of a coastal craftsman who understood that some work required witnessing. The room was small, barely 10 feet square, and the ceiling had preserved it almost perfectly from the coastal damp. It smelled of old paper and something woody, cedar shavings perhaps, and when she found the oil lamp on the shelf and lit it with the last match from the kitchen, the light showed her a space her grandmother had prepared with care. Shelves along 2 walls. On the shelves, filing boxes, the kind with lids, each labeled in Florence's handwriting. And on the small table in the center of the room, a leather diary, square-cornered, dark green with a clasp. "My father told me," Carl said from the doorway, "that she said she'd been building a case against someone who was trying to take the land from the trust." He was quiet for a moment. He didn't know who. She didn't tell him. But he said she was very clear about one thing. It wasn't finished. She said she ran out of time. Eleanor ran her finger along the filing box labels. She could read them from here. Land trust parcels, deeds and surveys, 1971, 1987. Wire transfer records, unauthorized with documentation. Correspondence, P. Marsh, 1983-1987. Florence Marsh, last will and testament, signed copy. The last box on the bottom shelf was labeled, "For Eleanor. Read this first." Duke had stepped into the room and sat at her feet. She felt him lean against her shin. "Thank you, Carl," she said, "for maintaining the building, for the brickwork." "My father's instructions," he said, "and mine." She heard him gathering his tools in the hallway, and then the quiet of the cottage settling around her, and the sound of the Atlantic below the cliff, and Duke's even breathing at her feet. She spent the first hour reading the box labeled, "For Eleanor," It contained, as the label suggested, a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, dated July 12, 1987, 2 months before Florence died. Florence had known about the wire transfers. Not guessed, known. She had copies of bank records she'd obtained through a contact in the state Financial Regulatory Office, a woman she'd worked with during the 70s on coastal protection legislation. She had a ledger she'd maintained herself, tracking the movement of funds through the non-profit she'd helped Eleanor establish. She had correspondence, formal letters mostly, but several handwritten notes, in which Patrick had revealed, through the particular carelessness of a man who did not expect to be caught, his intentions toward the land trust parcels. And she had this, a full copy of her own will, witnessed and notarized and identical to the one filed at the courthouse, naming Eleanor Frances Marsh as sole beneficiary of the cottage and the property. Patrick will try to contest the will. Florence had written in the last pages of the letter, "He has been trying to get his hands on the cottage for years. He will tell you I wasn't competent when I wrote it, or that he has a later document, or something else. He is a patient and clever man. What I have for you in the boxes is better than clever. It is documented. Take it to an attorney and tell them everything. I am sorry I won't be here to help you through it. I am sorry I didn't see what he was doing earlier. I should have moved faster. The cottage has always been meant for you. It has been your name on this deed since 1971. Come and live here. Florence." Duke was pressed against her side throughout the reading. She turned pages and he stayed. She set pages down and he stayed. When she stopped, finally, with the letter's last page in her hands, he shifted to put his chin on her knee, warm and deliberate and specific. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened the box labeled, "Wire Transfer Records Unauthorized." She spent 2 more hours in that room, in the oil lamplight with the Atlantic turning outside and Duke asleep against her feet, reading what her grandmother had spent 14 years assembling. The case against Patrick was thorough and clear and 35 years old, and, she was fairly certain, still actionable. The correspondence was damning in the particular way that made lawyers straighten in their chairs, specific, dated in Patrick's own words, laying out exactly what he'd planned and why. She had gone to prison for what Patrick had done. The documentation to prove this had been sitting in a sealed room in a cottage on the North Carolina coast since 1987. She sat with this fact for a long time. Duke woke at some point, she didn't register exactly when, and stood and walked one circuit of the small room, nose checking each corner, and then came back and lay down on her feet. She felt his warmth through her shoes. The leather diary was the last thing she took from the room. Florence had kept it for the last 5 years of her life. It began in 1982 and ended in the summer of 1987, the entries growing shorter as the months went on, as if Florence had known she was running out of something. The last entry was dated September 2, 1987, 4 days before Florence died. "The room is sealed. Carl's father finished today. I stood in the hallway and watched him lay the last course. He is a good man and his son will be good too, I told him. Someone named Eleanor will come someday, he said. I'll tell my son to watch for her. I am tired, I have done what I can, the rest is Eleanor's. I planted the rosemary by the gate 20 years ago because she said once, when she was small, that she liked the smell. It will still be there when she comes. Rosemary is stubborn." Eleanor looked up from the diary. She set it on the table and went to the doorway of the sealed room and through into the hallway and out the back door into the cold December evening. The rosemary was there, a large mounded plant at the corner of the cottage, gone woody with age, the stems thick as her thumb at the base. She broke off a small sprig. The smell of it in the cold salt air was unmistakable. She stood in the December evening with the sprig of rosemary in her hand and her grandmother's diary on the table inside and Duke's nails crossing the floor toward her. He came and sat beside her in the cold air and looked at the ocean with her. She brought the filing boxes to the main room, dragging them through the bricked doorway one by one, and she built a fire in the fireplace, coastal pine from the woodpile at the side of the cottage, dry and quick, and she sat at the dining table with the files spread around her while the fire made the room habitable. Duke lay between her and the fire, his length stretched on the bare floor, his chin on his front paws, his eyes moving between her face and the door. She read systematically the way she'd taught herself to read in prison, without hurry, without the need to finish quickly, taking in each document fully before moving to the next. The wire transfer records, the ledger, the correspondence, the land trust survey maps with Patrick's annotations in the margins, his calculations of per-acre value, his notes on development potential. The picture that emerged was detailed and specific. Patrick had been siphoning funds from the nonprofit since 1984, 3 years before Florence. Sealed the room, which meant Florence had caught on to it by then. He had been moving money to the holding company that would later become his development company, and he had been using Eleanor's status as executive director to explain why the transfers appeared to originate from her accounts. When she'd been convicted in 2011, she'd had no idea any of this paper trail existed. Patrick had by then had 24 years to make sure she wouldn't find it. She thought about the prison years, the particular gray weight of days inside, the specific grief of a life suspended, the world continuing outside while she remained fixed, the accumulation of everything lost, her work, her reputation, her home, the years themselves. Then she thought about the filing boxes, about Florence in 1987, 2 months from dying, directing Carl's father to lay brick to seal what she'd built, to tell his son to watch for a woman named Eleanor. The fire crackled. Duke moved his head from his paws and looked at her with the patient directness she'd come to know as his equivalent of, "I'm here, keep going." She kept reading. At the bottom of the correspondence box, she found the last letter Patrick had sent to Florence, dated August 1987. It was short and civil-sounding and entirely unmistakable in its implications. "Mother tells me you've been in poor health. I will be stopping by the cottage next month to review the trust documents and the property inventory. I think it's time we discussed the family's options." Florence had died in September. Patrick had not gotten to the cottage in time. Eleanor set the letter down carefully. She looked at the fire, at Duke, at the window and the dark December evening outside and the invisible ocean below the cliff. She had spent 12 years trying to understand how a life could be dismantled so thoroughly, so quickly, by someone she'd trusted entirely. She held the answer now in a filing box. She did not cry easily. She had not cried in prison, had trained herself against it in the first months, understanding that the only available space in a place like that was internal, and she needed to keep it clear and functional. She had cried twice since release, once in the parking lot of the law firm in Beaufort, reading the 4 sentences from Florence. Once in the car after the motel in New Bern, she cried now, not for herself, though some of it was for herself, for the 12 years, for the work she'd lost, the non-profit, the land parcels that had been sold while she was inside, for her 20s and 30s and 40s and now her 60s, all of it marked by what Patrick had done. She let herself feel the weight of that, fully for perhaps 10 minutes, but mostly she cried for Florence, for a woman who had seen clearly what was happening and had spent 5 years building a record, brick by careful brick in the time she had left, who had sealed a room in a cottage and told a craftsman's son to watch for her granddaughter and planted rosemary by the gate because Eleanor had said as a child that she liked the smell, who had not lived long enough to see Eleanor come, who had done everything she could from the distance of 1987 and then run out of time. Duke moved against her. He didn't put his head in her lap. Instead, he pressed the full length of his side against her leg, solid and warm, and leaned, not much, just enough, the way a wall leans back when you put your weight on it. She put her hand on his back and held on. She knew, she said after a while. Her voice was steadier than she expected. She knew exactly what she was doing. Duke turned his head and looked at her, held the look. "I know," she said. The will was clean and current, and there was a notarized copy in the box and a filed copy at the Floyd County Courthouse. At the Carteret County Courthouse, she corrected herself, being more careful now with facts. The cottage was hers. Had been, legally, since Florence's death in 1987. Patrick had filed a competing document, a later will supposedly handwritten, leaving the cottage and all property to him, and it had been accepted at the time due to Eleanor's incarceration and inability to contest it. Florence had anticipated this and left instructions in the letter. The notarized copy predated the competing document by 6 years and bore the signatures of 2 witnesses who had since died, but whose notarization records still existed in the county files. She would need an attorney. She knew this. She would need specifically a good attorney, and she would need to spend money she didn't quite have on the kind of legal process that could take years. She accepted this without grief. She had done 12 years of something much harder than legal process. The documentation in the files was not 12 years old. Patrick's misuse of the nonprofit funds was documented through 2011. Florence's records were from 1987, but the pattern they established made the later transactions, when examined with those records as context, suddenly explainable in a way they hadn't been at trial. She was not certain what charges were still actionable after 30 years. She was certain the documentation would matter. She put everything back into the boxes carefully in order. She stacked the boxes against the west wall of the main room. Duke stood and walked to the cottage door and back, completing what she'd come to think of as his checking-in walk, a circuit that confirmed the space was still settled, that nothing had changed, that everything was as it should be. He returned and lay down at her feet with a long, steady exhale. She sat with her hands folded on the cleared table. 12 years of certain wrongness, one sealed room she would call an attorney in the morning. She went outside when the fire had burned to coals. The December night on the North Carolina coast was cold and clear. The cloud cover had broken. During the afternoon, and the stars were extraordinary above the dark ocean, the Milky Way a smear across the black. She stood on the cottage's small porch and looked at the water. It ran dark and enormous and continuous, the swells catching star-glint at their peaks. She walked around to the gate, the teak sign, Marsh Cottage, 1923. She'd seen teak signs at other coastal properties, decorative things new bought at marine supply stores. Florence's sign was original, 100 years old this decade, every letter as sharp as the day the router bit had cut it. Teak didn't rot, it didn't bleach, it didn't bow or crack or surrender to the coastal weather that had stripped everything else to bare gray wood. Florence had known this. She had chosen teak for a reason. So that your name would still be on the gate, Eleanor thought, whenever you got here. Duke had come through the gate beside her and was now at the rosemary plant, nosing the woody base of it. He snipped off a small stem with the delicacy of a dog who understood the difference between investigating and destroying, and carried it back to her and set it at her feet. She picked it up. It smelled, even in the cold, like something living and permanent and specifically hers. She'd said once, as a small child, that she liked the smell of rosemary. She didn't remember saying it. She didn't remember much of her grandmother from those years. Florence had died when Eleanor was 12, which meant there were years of memory available, but they were childhood memories, soft-edged and incomplete. Florence had remembered. She stood at the gate of the cottage that had always been hers, the one she'd come to at 65 with a dog and a second-hand car and a legal case that would take years, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel this soon. The particular warmth of being known, of having been seen by someone who was now dead, clearly enough that the seeing had lasted 40 years and found her here. Duke sat beside her, leaning against her leg, looking out at the road and the rose-cane darkness beyond it. She had learned, over 12 years, not to expect anything. The dog had not learned this. That was the difference, and it had mattered. Duke had stood at the bricked wall before Eleanor had understood what she was looking at, had sat with absolute patience through 40 minutes of Carl Henderson's careful brickwork, through 2 hours of oil lamp reading in the sealed room, through the long hours at the table with the documentation of everything her brother had taken from her. He had not been restless. He had not needed the resolution to be immediate. He had learned in the prison program that trained him to trust that patient work produced the thing you were working toward, and he had extended that learning, without being asked, to include her. Eleanor Marsh had walked out of Alderson Federal Prison at 65 with a dog and an address and a grandmother's 4-sentence letter. She had come to a cliff cottage on the North Carolina coast and found a sealed room full of the truth about her life, the documentation of a crime committed against her, the deed to a property that had always been hers, and the evidence of a woman who had spent the last years of her life making sure that what had been taken would someday be returned. Florence had not lived to see it, but she had done the work. The truth doesn't disappear when you wall it up. It just waits for someone patient enough to dig. The cottage was cold and the fire needed building up, and there was a legal case to prepare and months or years of work ahead. Eleanor Marsh was 65 years old, and she was not afraid of work, and she was not afraid of time, and she found, standing at the gate of her grandmother's cottage in the December night with a sprig of rosemary in her hand and a dog at her knee, afraid of anything in particular. She went inside and rebuilt the fire. Duke lay down in front of it and closed his eyes.